There seems to be a general sense in the popular conception of history that there isn't much to learn from the way people lived before about 250 years ago. About 250 years ago, we had the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We collectively set out on, a number of massive waves of change in human societies and intimate life, technology, ethical ideas, political structures all went through some very large and noticeable changes, and that because of that, we've sort of entered a new era. You notice that a great deal of the popular history, the kind that's known to lay people, not just experts, often focuses on stories from this era, partly, just because we have far more usable records from this era, but partly I think there's a sense that there's nothing useful, nothing that can be put uh, into social use from earlier forms. Uh, One person whose work disagrees with this is the Canadian novelist Robertson Davies. He was a scholar and involved in the theater, and sometime in the 50s or 60s he started writing novels. And he put out about a dozen before his death. The first, they roughly come in trilogies, although the last trilogy he did not live to finish. The first trilogy was a fun little sort of social satirical trilogy about a small Canadian city called Salterton. They're quite charming character studies with a lot of comedic elements. You can really see the theatrical side of his work, and I enjoy them a lot. And they have well developed themes, but they are like lighthearted novels, though very good ones at that. But then the later trilogies, especially the one that he's best known for, the Deptford trilogy, which is three books that I think were written in the 70s, um, develop very strongly the theme of there is still much we can learn from the the culture and the ideas and the sort of artistic tone, the approach to life of people from the medieval and the early modern era. He tends to find some elements that still live on in our culture that share continuity with those earlier lives that people lived, and he develops them in his novels. His characters take a deep interest in work that is generally considered before the modern era, perhaps right on the cusp. So in his best known novel, Fifth Business, which is the first book in the Deptford trilogy, and is really an excellent standalone novel, um, the main character has a deep interest in hagiography, the study of saints, because he believes he may have experienced contact with someone who, if this were an earlier time, would have been potentially a saint. And the mystery of this kind of continues through his life and leads him into the study of saints and to discuss it with others, and it has this profound impact on his whole personal approach to the world. The second is uh, a book called The Manticore, and it's a book built around Jungian analysis. And Carl Jung, of course, was a deep student of earlier mythology and pre-modern ways of thinking, and the the man who is undergoing this analysis is the narrator of the book. He's a very successful lawyer and, a thoroughly modern, skeptical, rational man, but he finds himself in the middle of his life undergoing a deep psychological crisis, and by engaging with these earlier ideas, even though he's, of course, very resistant to them at first, but engaging with earlier ideas about how personality works, and by using language that comes from the pre-modern era, he's able to come to some better peace um, with himself and to weather this crisis in his life. And then the third is called World of Wonders, and is a very interesting little book. It's written as a man telling the story of his life to some people that he's working with, and he's a conjurer. He is a magician. Implied he's one of the best in the world, and he sort of tells the story of his life, and growing up with a circus sideshow and being part of this subculture, which extends back before into the early modern and even the medieval era. This culture of like jongleurs and acrobats and people doing these stage acts which are hundreds of years old, and he grows into this in the modern era. He's sort of like a fossilized form of an earlier type of person. It's a charming book. It's a little more. It's a little less magical, perhaps, than the first two, but it really extends Davies' sense that there's still a lot of meaning and wonder in the world that was charted just as well by people from medieval and Renaissance times as it has been by people in modern times. There's these touches of uncertainty and association that, even though we have rationality and science to guide our politics and our policies and our sense of how the material world works, that on the human level, on the level of what we might call the level of making meaning, that there's still quite a lot to learn from people of any time, from saints, from mythologies, from sideshow and the old traditions of Bohemia. Davies continues to extend this in his second trilogy, the Cornish trilogy, which is about academics in a Canadian university, and primarily about sort of like humanities professors who are all interested in older, reasonably old literature and arts, and feel drawn to these ideas and try to live out some of what they implicate, even though it's in modern day Canada. One of the characters in the books is a champion of Francois Rabelais, the lawyer and writer whose novel Gargantua and Pantagruel is seen by some as just a major pivot in the history of European literature, away from purely clerical and sacred literature and towards the more humanistic, secular literature that we now assume to sort of be something like the norm. And they champion Rabelais to people. You can hear Davies' voice pretty clearly behind it. And Rabelais, of course, is just the kind of person who might appeal to Davies. He's full of little bits of nonsense and large jokes and cunning allusions and satire, which is also the kind of writer that Davies is. In his last two books, Davies has a really interesting book in terms of its structure called Murder and Walking Spirits, Murder and Ghosts, in the modern phrase, and he builds a book around a ghost who has been killed at the start of the book. A man who's been killed at the start of the book, and then sort of floats around in modern day Canada, visiting a film festival, but whereas the other people are watching the movies, when the movies turn on, he sees instead the history of his ancestors from the point of the ones who arrived in Canada as loyalists who had to flee the American colonies after the Revolution, and then stepping forward, every generation seeing pieces of his family picture form, and it winds up being this kind of genealogy of Ontario in the form of a bunch of movies seen by a ghost. It's really, really a very charming and well put together. It has a lot of just really cunning historical characterizations. It has a lot of beautiful use of language, picking out the phrases and words that a person of a particular time might use, and all through these sort of threads of what we might call the Canadian character. It's just a lot of fun. Highly recommend that one. You can read it on its own very easily. And then his final book was called The Cunning Man. And a cunning man was a job that people used to have, something like a wise woman. They were, a person who was sort of claimed something like what we would call magic, and they would sometimes advertise even in early newspapers, and generally they were seen as healers, people who helped with some sort of illness. And the main character in this book is a doctor who becomes deeply interested after he finishes his medical training in different forms of diagnosis and treatment. He's a good rationalist, but he's also drawn to the idea that healing a person does not necessarily automatically mean some form of scientific biomedical treatment. So he starts using literature, for example, to treat wounded soldiers. He's serving in a hospital during World War II, and these are guys who receive serious wounds and have to face a dramatically different prospect in their lives. And he tries using more indirect methods of treatment to get them to open up and to develop better attitudes towards the future, and he's quite successful. And this leads him to other ideas, medieval ideas about medical treatment, which involve a really detailed focus on the patient's whole way of life, not just their particular complaint. And he becomes something like what we might call a holistic healer. He's a consulting physician who, it's like when other physicians are like, oh, I can't quite figure out what's wrong with you, maybe you should go see this guy. They see him as an eccentric and a weirdo, but they tolerate him because he does, you get the feeling, take a lot of difficult patients off of their laps. But also he's very successful. He has a deep interest in people. He's interested in their diet. He's interested in their history. He's a very good listener. And you can see Davies sort of reaching for something of the older role of healer amid all of this sort of specialization in hospitals and doctors that we have nowadays, and which have produced, profound improvements in human health, but have also left some of the traditional functions of healers kind of by the wayside. So by building this character study of a man who, in our present skeptical, hyper-modern moment, who still manages to find a way in which to practice this older art, this really kind of sums up a major element of Davies' literature, which is life isn't that different. 1,000 years ago, people worried about the stuff we worried about, and they looked for answers for it in much the same way that we do. And we should not see ourselves as so divorced from their experience that we can't learn from them, because what we find there might be what we're missing.